While we're relatively certain criminals in early 20th century Birmingham weren't nearly as stylish, intelligent, and ruthless as those depicted in Peaky Blinders, the show is definitely based on historical people and events, albeit loosely. How loosely? Pretty loosely, actually. Here's the truth about the real-life Peaky Blinders. As BBC News tells us, Birmingham in the mid and late 19th century was a violent, overcrowded place. Extreme poverty and a surplus of young men with no hope of employment led to the formation of street gangs, who would regularly brawl over control of tiny areas of the city. These gangs were brutally violent, and the brawls often left many of the gang members dead. Unlike organized crime outfits like the Mafia, however, these gangs didn't have a strict structure. They dissolved and formed into new groups on a regular basis. By the 1890s, 30 years earlier than in the series, a gang called the Peaky Blinders had formed. As Esquire explains, the gang probably didn't sew razors into their caps to blind people. Razor blades were considered an expensive luxury item in those days, and manufacture of them had only just begun, so it's unlikely the Blinders could have gotten their hands on them. As noted by Smithsonian Magazine, the Blinders most likely got their name from their peaked caps and the usage of blinder as a slang term for a stylishly dressed person. Gang members frequently used heavy belt buckles as cudgels in their street fights, or guns, when they could get them, but no razors. The show begins in 1919 with the leader of the Blinders, Tommy Shelby. Shelby suffers from undiagnosed PTSD after serving in World War I, navigating through the violent underworld of Birmingham. The show implies that the gang has been operating for a very long time in Birmingham. Everyone treats the Blinders like an institution. However, the real Peaky Blinders gang operated in Birmingham much earlier than the 1920s, and for a relatively short period of time. The Birmingham Mail reports that the gang emerged in the 1890s to challenge the Cheapside Sloggers, a prior gang that had ruled the streets for about 2 decades. The Blinders were supreme for about 2 decades themselves before being largely supplanted by rival gangs. By the 1920s, the time in which the show was set, a gang called the Brummagem Boys, which then mutated into the Birmingham Gang, reigned supreme in the area. The Brummagem Boys were the real deal, but that name lacks the sizzle of the Peaky Blinders, which might explain why the producers tweaked the timeline. Though the Peaky Blinders enjoyed their few decades of infamy, their gang name devolved into something that carried far less social weight. As author Philip Gooderson points out, the term Peaky Blinder came to be a common term for a specific kind of well-dressed, violent street thug. There are examples of police referring to members of other gangs as, quote, one of their Peaky Blinders, and the like, which is a clear testimonial to the impact the Peaky Blinders gang had on the criminal underworld during their relatively brief existence. It's also possible that the term was occasionally used to refer to criminal gangs in general, instead of a specific gang. Gooderson suggests that it was an early 20th century equivalent of something like the very British insult chav, a brash, loutish, and violence-prone youth. The writers of Peaky Blinders knew what they were doing when they gave numerous characters PTSD and World War I backstories. The Blinders aren't good, wholesome people, so a tinge of sympathy goes a long way when it comes to rounding out their character profiles. According to Smithsonian Magazine, the writers weren't too far off. We know for a fact that one major member of the real-life Blinders, Harry Fowler, actually did serve in World War I, and according to the Express and Star, he wasn't the only gang member to do so. Fowler's wartime experiences matched up with Tommy's horrifying memories. At one point, Fowler was buried alive when a mortar bombardment sent tons of earthworks crashing down on him. He emerged from the battle with serious injuries. In the show, Tommy Shelby is portrayed as a thoughtful criminal. He's not above killing, or worse, to get what he wants or to keep his family's interests safe. But he strives for a better, more peaceful life and lives according to a code.
I get the feeling that with a little provocation, you could be very persistent.
In real life, the men in the Peaky Blinders were far from philosopher crooks capable of the sort of intricate plans Tommy comes up with. As Smithsonian Magazine reports, Many of the real-life members of the gang were routinely arrested for small-scale, thoughtless crimes. The crimes listed on their ancient rap sheets include impulse offenses like shop breaking and bike theft, which imply crimes committed as opportunity presented itself, as opposed to carefully planned capers. As BBC News notes, the gang as a whole was kinda dumb. Their main activity involved random attacks on just about anyone passing by. They simply targeted anyone who looked unlikely to defend themselves, and they would steal anything they could without any sort of plan or coordination. This lack of sophistication was one reason they were so feared. You simply never knew when they would strike or against who. As mentioned before, one thing the TV series gets right about the real Peaky Blinders is their tendency to dress stylishly. Despite being a fairly unsophisticated and violent gang in a long line of unsophisticated and violent gangs, BBC News reports that the Blinders dressed to set themselves apart from the other gangs running wild on Birmingham's streets. They wanted to cultivate a classy image and ensure that people would know to be afraid when they approached. In fact, British GQ reports they were even better dressed than the show depicts, wearing silk scarves, bell-bottom trousers, and of course their signature peaked caps. The gambit worked. At the peak of their power in Birmingham, the Blinders became celebrities of a sort in the city. People often claimed to be members of the gang or associated with them simply to bask in the attention and the reflected glamour. In fact, when street brawls broke out, it was often impossible to know how many of the fighters were actually Peaky Blinders as opposed to locals hoping to be mistaken for them. You might not be surprised to learn that a violent gang that attacked people in the street and regularly brawled for control of territory and criminal enterprises didn't get along with local law enforcement. Police certainly take on their work knowing full well that it will put them at odds with violent, brutal people who won't hesitate to hurt them. But where most gangs only target police when they feel threatened, the real Peaky Blinders took their hatred of the police to a whole new level. According to I Love MCR, the Blinders routinely and specifically targeted the police for beatings and even murder. They call the practice, quote, constable baiting, and over the course of the gang's 2 decades of dominance, it resulted in serious injuries for dozens of officers, and the deaths of several constables as well. Author Philip Gooderson notes that in 1897, the gang killed Constable George Snipe, and a few years later, they murdered an officer named Charles Philip Gunter. Several officers were forced to leave the police because of the injuries they received at the hands of the Peaky Blinders, simply for trying to do their jobs and keep the public peace. Tommy Shelby is presented as a tortured man who wouldn't mind straightening out and leaving behind his family's criminal legacy, but he's tragically undermined every time he gets close to this goal. In the first season of the show, a rival gangster named Billy Kimber is his main antagonist. Kimber controls his own gang, as well as the racecourses outside Birmingham. As Smithsonian Magazine reports, there really was a Billy Kimber, and he really was a dangerous gang leader. But the show plays around with the truth a bit. Billy Kimber led the previously mentioned Birmingham Boys, who defeated the Blinders in the early 20th century, becoming the dominant gang in the city in the 1920s. According to I Love MCR, Kimber actually had been a Peaky Blinder, leaving that gang to form his own. Kimber was apparently very much like the character of Tommy Shelby, intelligent, violent, and charming when he wanted to be. The parallels are so striking that you have to wonder why the show's creators didn't just make him their main character. In fact, as reported by the Birmingham Mail, Kimber achieved Tommy's goal of going legit, dying after a prolonged illness in 1945 as a well-respected businessman. One interesting aspect of Peaky Blinders is how the female characters in the show are such powerful forces in what's typically considered to be the man's world of violent crime. Aunt Polly and the rest of the women involved with the gang are just as dangerous, intelligent, and formidable as the men.
But I will not behave myself.
You might assume that this is the writer's way to bring a modern-day viewpoint on gender equality to the time period, but it's actually not that far off from actual history. As noted by I Love MCR, there is some evidence that the women of Birmingham may have officially or unofficially joined some of the local gangs, And, as noted by British GQ, they definitely adopted some of the Peaky Blinder fashions in order to signal their connection to the gang. However, visible affiliation occasionally backfired, as the gang members were very violent toward their women. As noted by Radio Times, the time period of the show is important. With most of the able-bodied men, even the criminals, off to fight during World War I, it fell to the women to hold things together. Many women ran businesses they normally wouldn't have been accepted at, including criminal enterprises like gambling rackets. So it's entirely possible that someone like Aunt Polly might have kept the Blinders' businesses going during the war, and then been reluctant to give it up when the boys came home. When you live a violent life, you should expect a violent end. On television, the Peaky Blinders seem destined to go out in a hail of gunfire, probably with something burning to the ground behind them. In real life, it wasn't a rival gang that ended the reign of the Peaky Blinders and the other street gangs in Birmingham. It was economics. As noted by British GQ, Birmingham began to grow and prosper in the 20th century, and families began moving out of the city center. I Love MCR reports that a combination of social changes began to transform the city and reduce the gang's influence. These included smarter and more efficient policing, new factory jobs as the British economy transformed during the 20th century, and the rise of new ways for the young men to spend their time, including football clubs and newly built cinemas. And as BBC News notes, as the city grew, the space between rival gangs grew too, leaving them with fewer reasons to fight. By the time World War II arrived, the gangs were mostly a memory. Despite the vibe we might get from certain gang members in the show, the reality is that former members of the Peaky Blinders were in no rush to have their violent pasts remembered, and many of them didn't retire lavishly on their ill-gotten gains. As reported by BBC News, descendants of the members of the violent gang are usually amazed to discover the link because their ancestors didn't like talking about their criminal pasts. As noted by British GQ, historian Carl Chin has found that they were usually ashamed of the violence they'd engaged in and did their best to bury their pasts. And as Smithsonian Magazine reports, many of the Blinders had very sad ends, even if they survived their connection with the gang. Harry Fowler returned from serving in World War I severely injured, for example, and supported himself in bizarre fashion by selling photographs of himself dressed in drag as a Red Cross nurse. It's a far cry from the huge estate and stables that Tommy Shelby has on the show. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.